What does that mean for trade policy? We have a great panel assembled, starting with someone who joined us for our very first WITA Zoom webinar on March 26, 2020. My friend Simon Evenett. Welcome back, Simon. Simon is Professor of International Trade, Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen, founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade. Apologies if my accent is not right on pronunciation of that. Simon has been our guest several times since March of 2020. It's always a pleasure to welcome you back. Jimmy Goodrich, Vice President, Global Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association. They have had a very busy and successful year, I might say. Scott Paul, another frequent visitor on the WITA stage, President of the Alliance for American Manufacturing. Welcome back, Scott. Also want to welcome two newcomers to the WITA stage. The Honorary Nazak Nikakhtar, partner at Wiley Rein, senior fellow at the Center for Technology and Diplomacy at Purdue University and strategic advisor at Silverado Policy Accelerator. And our moderator, Jonathan Lang, Director for Trade and Supply Chains, Industrial and Consumer Goods at Eurasia Group. Jonathan was in touch with me early in the process of putting together the conference agenda and helped us scheme out this panel. Thank you, Jonathan. Take it away.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks to WITA certainly for organizing today's discussion, which really ties together a number of different threads that we've been discussing in conference panels today, and we'll continue to do so tomorrow. So you look at trade, supply chains, industrial policy. These are three themes which are increasingly interwoven in U.S. and international policy making, with an eye to improving supply chain resilience, interest in rehabilitating domestic manufacturing sectors, and the national security concerns, particularly with China, but also with Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. These drivers have not just animated policy activity in the US, but have also spurred the growth of similar policy in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. The confluence of trade and industrial policy activity, coupled with macroeconomic impacts of the pandemic, and global logistics challenges are certainly driving companies to reevaluate existing supply chain strategy, with some viewing this as part of a broader deglobalization or regionalization trend, some themes we've heard from some of the other panels as well. And it's within this geopolitical macroeconomic framework that I want to turn to the panel for today's discussion, who are really perfectly placed to dig into some of these topics. But let me first turn to Simon. So Simon, how do you view efforts in the U.S. and other developed markets, which have historically been less forward-leaning in industrial policy implementation? How do you see this policy agenda playing out? What do we see policy-wise, and where do we see it headed?
So thanks, Jonathan, for that question. I think the way to look at this is to argue that although these countries, the ones you mentioned, all say they are catching up as far as industrial policy is concerned, let's not forget they've been subsidizing industries and agriculture for a hell of a long time. What we're seeing is an acceleration from a base of subsidies that we've had in place for some time. We estimate that about 41% of global goods trade is now covered by some type of subsidy measure. And that's just the measures that we can document. There are plenty of hidden measures out there. So this has probably become the biggest global trade problem, which is there. And it's one which no one seems to be particularly interested in reining in or solving at the moment. You mentioned a whole range of problems the governments are trying to deal with, like supply chain resilience and building up strategic industries. Somehow governments have convinced themselves that handing out dollops of cash is the solution to these problems, whereas in fact the solutions might be elsewhere, such as reducing policy uncertainty. And the increasing lack of transparency that we're seeing in subsidy awards is clearly an additional problem as well. The last point I would make is that you're right to argue that subsidies beget subsidies. And nothing, I think, has depressed me more than seeing the cynical interpretation in Europe of the IRA, and somehow Europe waking up to the fact that America subsidizes its industries. And then what we have seen is essentially Paris and Berlin deciding to ramp up subsidies on the European side and using the IRA as a pretext for doing so. And I think this just is the start of a very, very bad downward spiral that we're going to see in the years ahead. I'm afraid I wish I could start more positively, but I do think the scene is one of increasing gloom and disruption and excess capacity and trade disputes. But let's hope I'm wrong.
Thanks, Simon. And let's turn next to Nazak to speak a bit more about the security and resilience aspects that Simon alluded to in supply chain industrial policy and how trade really fits in. And Nazak, you've really been at the kind of the forefront of some of these issues in your current and previous roles. But could you please provide thoughts on what the U.S. is doing, the tools at the administration's disposal, and the drivers of this policy direction, and where do you see the U.S. headed in the space moving forward?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jonathan. It's really good to be with everybody. So I want to sort of level set by reminding everybody that we are in a period where we're reorienting supply chains, right? With that comes challenges, but it also comes opportunities. But most importantly, we're going through growing pains, right? We're doing something in a sense that we haven't done in a long, long time, which was previously relying on market forces to kind of dictate where everything was going to go. Oh my gosh, China's a problem, and how do we pull back? And so you see sort of countries trying out different things. Not to say that we shouldn't make take policy steps to make sure that these things are being corrected, so we don't get into something like subsidy wars or other types of problems. But this is sort of a natural growing pain. I want to sort of kick off what we see with the Biden administration, and certainly from Congress too, is sort of this dual carrot sticks approach, right? We see more incentive programs to try to catalyze the growth of the industry. But then the question is who should benefit? Should it be American companies? Should it be foreign companies? Should it be companies from the countries of concern? That's going to be something that the government has to really grapple with policy, because we do see quite a bit of these incentives going to the Chinese companies and companies that are pretty much Chinese champions. So you know that they're influenced by the CCP. On the trade front, definitely still the sticks approach, tech transfer restrictions, capital flow restrictions, import restrictions on goods from forced labor, FCC with the telecom, the licensing restrictions, and then the Information Communications Technology and Services Supply Chain Executive Order that was issued by the Trump administration, endorsed by the Biden administration, and we're still waiting to see how that impacts supply chains. Maybe TikTok, maybe apps, whatever else that it might fit. You're also seeing the government make a huge push towards improving databases to to improve its enforcement, from OFAC to export controls to forced labor. I also want to just add business opportunities, right? So companies are worried about China. They want to try to move supply chains out of China. I emphasize the word try because it's not that easy. You have lead time constraints. How long does it take to kind of move to a different country, or avail yourself of the infrastructure in that country? Does that infrastructure exist? Raw materials. For semiconductors, Jimmy will talk about this, neon gas, germanium, gallium, super abrasives, right? Are those going to be available to a country where you go to, where you move supply chains? So countries now start needing to think about upstream. What do we stockpile in the meantime to make sure that as supply chains move, we have the resources we need? And then finally, geography matters. If you move all your supply chains to Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia, China, Taiwan, what have you, is embroiled in a conflict, you're not going to have access to those supply chains. So how do you think about more regional supply chains? Not to say that we wouldn't trade globally, but should a crisis happen, how do we want to have regional redundancies in our supply chain to assure ourselves that we're insulated from those shocks, should shocks to the supply chains happen? And the final point that is not often talked about, that I really wanted to stress, is that when we rely on allies and partners for critical supply chain capabilities, we need to make sure that those allies are committed to protecting the supply chains that we rely on. So do they have CFIUS type mechanisms, inward FDI screening, to make sure that the supply chains are safe from foreign investment? Do they have trade remedy type restrictions to make sure that imports don't hollow out the integrity of those industries? Are they going to ever commit to not put export restrictions on us, or to find essential workers the same way? So the discussion is nuanced, it's complex. Again, to underscore, we're all going through growing pains. but it's underscores why the discussion like this is so timely, because we need to start collectively thinking about solutions to the problem, because if we don't, we're kind of trending towards chaos.
Thanks, Nazak. And you somewhat alluded to kind of the nearshoring, friendshoring discussion as well. Certainly turn back to that in a few minutes. But emerging technology has certainly been a center point of the U.S.-China decoupling narrative that you were referencing there, and consequently, much of the focus of U.S. export control industrial policy has specifically been focused on semiconductors as a foundational technology. And semiconductor supply chains make for, in my opinion, a particularly interesting use case in the discussion of trade supply chains and industrial policy, given that those supply chains are perhaps more than others, were built to be highly innovative, yet also highly globalized. And Jimmy, turning to you, could you walk us through, like some of the policy direction, the response from industry, and Nazak outlined some of those tools that are being employed, in this discussion. Walk us through the industry response to that and where the industry would like to see things moving forward.
Great. Well, thanks, Jonathan, and good to be on here with new and old friends. It's good to see everybody. I think what happened with the semiconductor over the last couple of years is that, most of America and the rest of the world woke up to the fact that semiconductors are critical to the global economy. Just like the oil crisis of the 70s awoke the global geopolitical regimes around the world to the importance of oil. Now we understand the criticality of semiconductors. It's taken for granted. You use it all the time, but when you don't have access to it, then lives can be incredibly difficult. Just case in point, cars, washing machines that couldn't be built because of a lack of access to chips. And we all know that the US used to produce a huge percentage of those, around 40% in 1990, and now that's jumped to around 10% today. And East Asia, in particular, has grown as a hub for chip making. I think we sort of turned a blind eye in the US to the fact that it was due to many factors, but the driving factor, according to a study we did, is that governments around the world have, for decades, had strategic industrial policy and fiscal support for their domestic sectors. And so as a result, capacity and manufacturing jobs grew faster overseas than they did here in the United States. In fact, in 2019, there was an OECD study that found that virtually every other country around the world is providing financial incentives from the government to incentivize more chip fab construction, except the United States. So I think the pandemic, the tensions with China, tensions cross straits with Taiwan have really just underscored the need for the United States to get in the game. And we did that with the CHIPS Act. And so, instead of struggling to try and tell every other country around the world to stop incentivizing their own domestic manufacturing, we're simply joining in that race as well to attract investments here. So the hope is that we're going to, be embarking upon a major new industrial revolution here, with the Commerce Department poised to help administer the program, also the Treasury with the tax credit. And our hope is that this is going to be a very successful experiment to prove that targeted industrial strategy does work, particularly when you have a very clear-cut national security concern that's being addressed. In this case, 92% of all of the advanced chips today are being produced in Taiwan. China accounts for about 40% of all of our assembly and test and packaging of chips that we use today. So those numbers are just too high from a geopolitical perspective. And what the goal of the CHIPS Act is, and I think the administration and industry shares this, is to rebalance the supply chains to make them more resilient here at home. We'll never be fully independent from anyone, including China, but instead of having 0% of production of critical items, maybe we can have 5 to 10, 15%. So that in the time of a crisis, another pandemic, another natural disaster, geopolitical instability, we'll have optionality to provide a buffer and resiliency in the supply chain. I think the also really sort of different factor here is that, as opposed to perhaps industrial strategy in Europe, other parts of East Asia, the US is actually taking a allies and partners approach in addition to working with its domestic firms. I think this is really important because it's not about creating US national champions, a national chip fund like China's, but creating incentives to attract the best companies in the world, including the United States, to invest and grow here. So we're taking a really pro-competition, pro-growth approach, which is, again, is very different from other industrial programs you have around the world. What does this mean for trade policy? I think it means that for now, industrial strategy, industrial policy, and subsidies, at least in the semiconductor industry, are here to stay. Other countries all incentivize, so now we do as well. It do means, though, we need to better track and have transparency around programs so that we can avoid potential non-market oversupply down the road. We don't think that's going to happen, but we should take steps to try and alleviate that. And also coordination with some of our allies. We're never going to be able to come to an agreement over who built what, but we can have informal discussions with Europe, with Korea and others to ensure that we're not doing stupid things like creating triple or duplicative investments of the same thing to address the same problem. And I think we still need to work on trade policy regarding harmful subsidies, because some subsidies, particularly those in China, where the government has full control of the companies that's directing market outcomes, still lead to non-market overcapacity, and that's something that we should be thinking about. So that's on the offensive side. On the flip side, of course, the administration and Congress has pursued a robust export control agenda with the overt goal of now trying to preserve U.S. and allied comparative technological advantage over China and other key countries. This is a fundamental shift. In the past, it was around curtailing the spread of weapons mass destruction and curtailing military advancements, and that still remains the case, but I think we've now shifted to a much broader approach of using these tools for right or wrong, for also an industrial strategic objective. And so as we move forward in this case, I think it's important that the governments just keep things very focused, very multilateral, to ensure that, again, as with the CHIPS Act program, as with export control, they're tightly aligned with very clear and obvious national security objectives. So those are just a few thoughts, Jonathan, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jimmy. And, as I, mentioned initially, U.S. policy goals, certainly include national security, supply chain resilience, which Nazak discussed and Jimmy discussed, as well as the growth of the U.S. domestic manufacturing sector. Now, Scott, to you, from your perspective, and Jimmy outlined kind of the breakdown of the offensive versus, offensive trade mechanisms versus, some of the defensive and how, the trade policy has come to be, work in tandem with some of the domestic investment mechanisms that we've seen, including CHIPS, as was brought up, IRA, the infrastructure law. But how would you see this policy path? How has it impacted your organization, the domestic labor manufacturing front in the U.S. and also, once again, just to round it out, how would you like to see the policy, what would be the next steps in your preference, in this policy trajectory?
Thanks, Jonathan. It's a good question and a lot to unpack there. And I'm honored to join my fellow panelists today. Look, I think part of this, and you have to consider trade as one of the components of an overall strategy. None of this is analog, where there's a single subsidy or there's a single modality. The effective wielding of industrial power is much like a DJ on a mixing board that has 16 or 17 different levers that they can move up and down in concert with each other. And so I think the Biden administration, to its credit, has understood that it takes all of those. And I think it's actually the first administration that has done that effectively, where you need some defensive measures, you need some application of procurement, of investment, of research and development, investment in the workforce, investment in our infrastructure, an examination of what our weaknesses are. So there's multimodalities here to a degree that you haven't seen before, kind of outside of the national security sector. And I think that that's an important breakthrough in policy. To build on that momentum, I think that we'll need to quite honestly expand the scope beyond semiconductors. And there's not going to be certainly a CHIPS Act for every sector of the economy, but even within the Biden administration's own review of some of our supply chain weaknesses, we have a lot of work to do in pharmaceutical and medical devices, in batteries and critical minerals, in a lot of new and emerging technologies as well. where we may have some of the research and investment capacity, but much of the productive capacity is elsewhere. And unfortunately, for a lot of it, much of the productive capacity may be in countries of concern, like China or Russia or others that may present vulnerabilities. And so I would say at this point, look, the results that we've seen so far, and Jimmy is certainly keenly aware of these within the semiconductor industry, is that you've seen a lot of capital investment announcements. In the next step is filling those factories up. And you're seeing it in other sectors where you've seen this application of industrial policy as well. You've seen an EV charging manufacturing sector spur up a lot of it from foreign companies in the United States. You've seen companies invest in fiber optic cable manufacturing in the United States because of the requirements in the infrastructure law. And certainly you've seen that with other battery companies around the United States as well. And so you have seen an extraordinary amount of investment, certainly in emerging areas of manufacturing that might not otherwise have occurred to that level. And I think a lot of that is due to a fairly proper mixing of all these modalities of industrial policy. And I will say, obviously, there has been a backlash to this because we have not, we've not pursued policy in this way outside a very limited scope of industries. And I think that to some degree, it's been taken for granted that we would not. And I think that says less about our political interest, our policy goals, and I think more about some assumptions that may not have been accurate. But we have to protect our rights, certainly when we face the weaponization of supply chains by countries of concern like China. And we've seen these vulnerabilities exposed over the course not only of the pandemic, but other black swan events that we've had in the past. And so I think having some degree of preparedness is wise from a policy perspective. I think that we can, where we can, we should collaborate with our allies on this, and certainly some of these export controls and restrictions with respect to semiconductors. Seems like we're pursuing that strategy, but I think that this is the first word and kind of not like the last step in terms of where a lot of this is headed, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Scott, and thanks to everyone for your initial thoughts, breaking down this kind of emerging policy picture. But I'd like to open it up to everyone to comment on some of the points raised by some of the other panelists. As I mentioned, these themes are interwoven, they're interdependent. But I did want to first circle back to Simon to get your take, given the comments that we've heard on how you're viewing the direction of global trade in light of some of these policy paths, these preferences, and I mentioned at the outset, some see this as the kind of the path towards regionalization. Do you see that, and would that necessarily be a bad thing?
So maybe I can say a few things here. I mean, first, what you've heard from our fellow panelists is exactly what I heard when I was in Brussels last week listening. I mean, we hear exactly the same arguments being put forward by industry for subsidies which they think they can justify, which I must say I have yet to hear a compelling justification for many of the subsidies which have been put forward, at least the arguments for them. It just seems to be that tit for tat is the name of the day. It's hard to know if subsidies are the solution, what exactly is the problem that we're trying to solve here. And I think this then takes us very much to Nazak's comments. I mean, she described our supply chains as being in problems, but did anyone really appreciate that? How well do you expect supply chains to work when governments are shutting down workforces and economies with orders to stay at home? I mean, how did you expect these supply chains to work, especially also when you had such excess surges for demand for products? So why did anyone think that these supply chains would work fabulously well? They were never designed for this particular purpose. I think what we're seeing is, of course, the backlash. Some people are calling for regionalization and like, but trade is heavily regionalized to start with anyway. So the idea that it's going to become even more regionalized, I think, is possibly actually exacerbating risks. The whole idea of sourcing globally is to be able to reduce risks. And of course, if there are single points of failure, yes, let's try and reduce them. But I find this move towards bringing stuff home and nearshoring and friendshoring deeply worrying, because who is a friend today could well be an enemy tomorrow. So to be honest, the more I've unpacked all of this, I don't find a particularly compelling logic. And I'm heartened actually to hear more and more critiques of the deglobalization narrative emerging, because really these people have had way too much of the airspace in the last 12 months or so. We really need to start getting back to, if we have problems, how do we fix them? And we really need to ask the question just how many sectors are truly exposed to overdependence on China and the like. Is semiconductors unique, or is it a general case? I'm not so sure of that either. So I would urge for a much more evidence-driven approach rather than this narrative-driven approach, which we've heard so much of in the last 12 months.
Jonathan, I'd like to add there to all of Simon's good points, maybe agree on some respects and provide a counter narrative. I was talking to the Europeans about sort of where we think supply chains are going to go. And I had posited, look, I think we're going to come into a world of regionalization, because look at what's happening now with Europe, with access to energy problems, companies in Europe now looking to shift supply chains to China, right? I mean, there's even regionalization, I think, this ex-China globalization might create some problems. But I do think that we're going to trend towards regionalization. And I think within the regionalization, we'll still have redundancy in our supply chains with having capacity in the nations of our allies. But the point there, which improves competition, improves sort of economies of scale, overall trends towards reducing prices. But the reason you want to do something like that is, again, if a region, an area is taken offline, you have redundancy in the supply chain. Now, the Europeans sort of flipped out when I said this, and they were kind of shocked. But the point is, look at the auto sector. The competition, we produce autos, or our European friends produce autos, and we're able to trade, and we're all able to benefit from each other's supply chains. But should a region go offline because of some type of issue, natural forces or conflict, then the other region has its ecosystem to supply themselves and perhaps to supply their friends and partners abroad to the extent that there's a crisis. The other couple of points I wanted to mention are that, this industrial policy isn't just a new thing. In the last administration, we were very much pushing towards this, because in taking the way that the defense industrial base works and pushing it out to critical domestic sectors, right? Subsidies aren't always the answer, but let's look at the industries that are critical to our supply chains. And let's look at how do we incentivize domestic investments, nearshoring, friendshoring investments, all of those. But let's really try to take a look at those policies. With respect to just final few points, APIs, I mean, there's a lot of sort of discussion about APIs, but not real good solutions in terms of what do we do domestically. And the first thing that we have to start with is looking what our capacity is at home. We have pharmaceutical industries here. What can they produce? What's the lead time? What's the cost? And then let's try to solve for what they can't produce. So we've got to be thoughtful in other ways about how we approach these problems, rather than just sort of hair on fire, sky is falling, and then the paralysis that comes with not knowing what to do. On critical minerals, we've done a lot of good stuff in terms of incentivizing domestic R&D and domestic growth, but we still have a challenge to access to global mines, right? Mines around the world that China's running around and gobbling up and purchasing. So we've got to solve for that aspect too. And then finally, LNG and digital currency. There's no reason why we should be exporting so much LNG to China when China's turning it around and resending it to Europe. We've got to think more strategically about that. And then digital currency, every much we fall behind, China's going to leverage its partnerships with other countries to encourage them to use the digital yuan and ultimately displace US manufacturers from the global ecosystem by mandating reliance on the digital yuan. So the challenge is, again, are so vast, and we really need to start thinking about how we're going to tackle each one of them thoughtfully. And from a trade practitioner, trade remedies perspective, we actually build a lot of supply chain resiliency by putting import restrictions. When unfairly priced goods are hollowing out and weakening out our industries, we put tariffs in place, not just for the willy-nilly sake of tariffs, but to actually deliver price corrections so the market behaves the way it needs to. And that goes a long way in helping domestic industries rebuild. And we should really think about that more aggressively as well.
Thanks, Nazak. Thanks, Simon. And welcome everyone else to jump in as they would like. But I did want to turn quickly to Jimmy to follow up on some things that Scott specifically noted in his opening comments around, we're talking about semiconductors, particularly just given, the volume of policy activity in that space. But as Scott mentioned, and a lot of this, it dates even back to the Trump administration, as Nazak mentioned, but certainly the Biden administration really, provided the whole of government mirror and the 100-day supply chain reviews and the one-year supply chain reviews goes well beyond semiconductors. But a lot of the focus of the policy recommendations there was specifically specifically onshoring and reshoring of that capacity, something you picked up in your comments. Where do you see kind of the nearshoring, friendshoring, and more broadly the work with international partners of the U.S. in this space? How can that better play in from the perspective of the semiconductor industry?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jonathan. So, the semiconductor industry is vast. It has a lot of different links across the supply chain. There's low-end activity. There's extremely high-end activity. I think the U.S. goal is really to capture as much of the high value add activity we can across both manufacturing and design as part of the CHIPS Act. But there's going to be some parts of the supply chain, particularly lower end assembly, test, and packaging, some of the materials and gases that go into chip manufacturing, rare earth processing, that we may never be competitive in, even with the CHIPS Act funding, but still have over concentration in places like China. So I think that's why, as part of the CHIPS Act, there is actually a $500 million program to help allied countries work with the US to develop some of those supply chains. You see the Secretary of Commerce talking about working with allies and partners, working with India, Mexico, to bring some of those supply chains out of geopolitically risky territory. It's broader than just semiconductors, though, because if we're thinking about the electronic supply chain, and we reshore some of the advanced chip production here, that's good. But we don't want to then just send the wafers back to China for assembly, test, and packaging. But beyond that, we don't want to send a finished chip to laptop, PC, phone, other assembly that happens in one country as well. So it needs to be a broader conversation around what can the US do with its allies, whether it's Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, other parts of the world around assembling a more geographically diverse electronic supply chain. I think that's in the interest of everyone. We saw during COVID what it means to be totally concentrated in one country. COVID lockdowns in Shanghai shut down virtually the entirety of the world's electronic supply chains and exacerbated the chip shortage and drove up pricing on consumer electronics. And that was just a short couple week delay in one city. Imagine what it would be under a much more severe circumstance.
Thanks, Jimmy. And pulling that thread a bit more on kind of the nearshoring, friendshoring conversation, and Nazak, something you mentioned in your remarks that really, when you look at U.S. trade policy, a lot of it is very much stick focused, with the carrot being domestic subsidies and the reshoring, onshoring narrative. But what, if any, role would new market access, what role could it play in this narrative? So, once again, pulling on that thread of nearshoring and friendshoring, and this is something I think we're seeing a bit more from Europe as it, grapples with some similar challenges, using that as an incentive, a tool of incentivization to encourage broader diversification, not exclusively nearshoring and friendshoring. But I'd be interested to hear from the panelists on what role that could play.
I would just add. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we should always be striving towards integration of supply chains, ecosystems with allies. With that said, I think our agreements really need to be formalized. We don't want to be in a situation where we rely on, Mexico, for example, on assembly, testing, and packaging, for example, in semiconductors. And I mentioned that because Jimmy just mentioned it. And, we get to another crisis where, either the Chinese own the assembly, testing, packaging facilities in China and use that as leverage over us, or basically, there's another crisis, and then there's export control. So what I'm pretty basically saying is that these critical sector supply chains, and I'm just talking about critical sectors that we need for defense, for critical components of our economy, we need to make sure that we're formalizing agreements with allies so that what we promise to assure them, they reliably know that they can have access to, and vice versa. And also, our trading partners are pretty much kind of one-sided in terms of market access. They still have pretty much unrestricted access to the U.S. markets, but it's not reciprocal. And just by virtually lowering our already low tariff rates, right, we're not going to get anywhere. So we need to think creatively and strategically about what other inducements we can provide to them to ensure that we have market access to their economies, so that what we build here, we actually have real credible export markets. Because no matter what we build here, if we don't have an ecosystem to sell to, right, we're never going to grow. Our growth is going to be capped at a certain level.
I would just add to that. I think, understanding that even with a resilient and rebalanced supply chain here in the United States, we're still going to be dependent on exports and global markets. For example, in the semiconductor industry, 80% of all of our products are sold overseas. And in order for the CHIPS Act to be competitive, we're going to need global markets for those fabs that the CHIPS Act is going to support to be able to export to. And so it's embracing a forward-leaning trade policy, looking at things like the expansion of the Information Technology Agreement that could expand the number of digital goods covered under that, all going to be beneficial to rebalancing and rebuilding a resilient supply chain. And I just think, our view very clear in the semiconductor industry is that we're never going to be self-sufficient, even for parts of the semiconductor supply chain. And so we have to understand that allies are going to be, and other countries are going to be part of this.
Yeah, if I could, I just want to add to, I think, what Nazak and Jimmy said. I think that, autarky is not the goal. It's more about resiliency and balance and security. I think that one of the concerns with respect to nearshoring and friendshoring is that it has benefits, but it also has loopholes. It has to have strong rules of origin, anti-circumvention methods, because we've seen in a number of clean energy industries and others how trying to turn off the spigot from state subsidized or dump products from China has had limited effect and has spilled over. And so I think that as we move forward, those arrangements, to Nazak's point, they need to be formalized, but they need to also have strong rules of origin and anti-circumvention methods in them, because I foresee that as being a big challenge. And I do think the roadmap to this, and I think that for listeners who are skeptical about the need for an industrial policy, take a look at the administration's supply chain report. It was released about a year ago, February 24th, 13 or 1400 pages. So it's not a beach read, but it is a very thorough, I think, and clear-headed look at some of the challenges and opportunities that we have that, again, I think started with semiconductors, but go into a range of industries that some of us have been raising the alarms of bells for a couple of decades, but that now we're all facing.
The other thing I'd add is that the international community really hasn't developed rules on oversupply, overcapacity. And so that is sort of the next frontier in terms of China's distortive trade practices. We saw it in steel and aluminum. I predicted 4 years ago that it was going to happen in semiconductors. It's just starting to happen now. And so this is becoming a massive problem. And absent a conversation internationally with our allies, of what we all commit to do about it and how we'll all commit to discipline it if it happens from outside our own borders. That's going to be an imperative for all of our supply chain.
Simon, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that particular line of conversation. I know there's some interesting points raised, both pro and con, raising both the positives and some of the potential loopholes that would create.
Look, I think people outside of the United States will be very heartened to hear that pursuing an augmented ITA agreement would be seen as desirable. I think they'd also be very keen to hear about what give and take in that negotiation the United States could bring to the table, because we're not hearing much of that from the Biden administration at the moment. I think with respect to tackling excess capacity, yes, let's talk about it, but let's not forget the decades-long problems we've had at the OECD trying to rein in steel overcapacity. So there's going to be a new approach needed there, and maybe we want to go back and think about whether we want to create the excess capacity in the first place. And that takes us back to whether we need to have stronger subsidy disciplines. And that can only happen at the WTO. And which big player is absent of the WTO at the moment? The United States. So again, I think you have to bring so much of this back to US policy. We need to align US policy nationally with its international aspirations. And forgive me for saying this, I don't hear that or see that from the Biden administration.
Thanks, Simon. And just I know we just have a few minutes left. It's a bit of a lightning round to wrap things up for this panel. And actually, I think it leads nicely into the following. But I'm going to go in reverse order here. Just maybe 30 seconds from each person on, there's a lot of policy that's captured in our conversation between trade supply chains and industrial policy, but what would you like to see in terms of a next policy step in this space, whether it be to address some of those loopholes, whether it be to ensure market access, whether it be to, make sure that we're, as USTR Catherine Ty notes, kind of balancing this with a worker-centric trade policy. I'm interested to hear where you would like to see policy go as a next step. And we can start with Scott.
Thanks, Jonathan. Briefly, I can think of two buckets. One would be with respect to while dealing with the upsides of reshoring or nearshoring and friendshoring, as I mentioned, to focus on strong rules of origin, anti-circumvention, particularly from countries of concern. Second, I think that we need to take a look at the aggressive actions on semiconductor restrictions and think about other strategic industries where we face similar vulnerabilities and where we can take executive action in concert with our allies to enhance our position. But there's a long list, but I'll highlight those two for the sake of time.
Thanks, Scott. And Jimmy?
Just thinking about how do we, as I mentioned, have a robust trade policy that can support the industrial restructuring that we're doing here at home. Working with allies, super important, as we've discussed for many different reasons. We can't pursue autarky. And then ensuring that, while the government is going to take national security actions with regards to export controls and securing our technology, that we get the balance right between openness and restriction to ensure that our industrial base is healthy here at home.
And Nazak, and then to Simon.
Two items. The fact that we have above 3.3 trillion, somewhere between 3 to 5 trillion going into China, a country with civil fusion, our dollars benefiting the PLA is enormously problematic. So we're starting to move in that direction. We need to expedite the movement there and then broaden FIRMA to capture greenfield investments in the United States by foreign countries of concern. We certainly cannot have China decimate our industries from within our own borders.
Simon?
Look, I think we need to ground a lot more of this conversation in actual serious risk assessments about where we see problems and threats to supply chains. I'm not persuaded about a lot of the evidence which has been put forward. And I think until we start sharing that evidence and putting it on the table and this becoming a fact-based conversation, there's going to be a lot of suspicion about what each of the big players are doing, not just the United States, but Europe and China too. So a bit more transparency, a lot more openness would go a long way to take the stress out of this situation.
All right, thanks everyone so much for a great conversation. I know we're a minute over, so Ken, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. A large diversity of views here.